Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for this session, Peer Learning Routines to Empower Multilingual Learners in Content Reading and Writing. My name is Mindy Teach, and I am a multilingual learner coach at Support Ed. And in this position, I provide professional development. I do some coaching with school districts, all in the effort to support multilingual learners and their teachers. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Jasmine Singh, who is going to be doing some back-end support for me today. So she might be dropping some links into the chat to help you throughout the session. So Jasmine and I are just two of the Support Ed team that are here today. I just want to acknowledge the entire team behind us. Support Ed is a small women-owned business that's based in Fairfax, Virginia. And all of the work that I'm presenting today comes from our own experiences in classrooms and working with teachers. And you'll see a little bit later a book that was published by some of my colleagues. And we always like to start from a place of gratitude. We really appreciate being here today. I know you probably had a couple of different sessions you could have chosen from, so I'm glad that you're here joining us today, learning more about empowering multilingual learners. Throughout the session today, in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a couple of icons just to give you a little bit of information, either if a resource is available on a Padlet, or if we're going to be asking you, we're not really going to have discussions today, but I may be asking you to drop some of your thinking or some of your ideas into the chat. And we do have a video, and I also have a Google folder of materials. So some of the information that you see in a slide might be in a Google folder. And to get us started, I'll just share our objectives. So for today, we are going to discuss relevant research on the importance of multilingual learners engaging in peer learning activities. We're going to explore some considerations, some things that we might want to think about as you start planning some of these peer learning activities. And then at the very end of the session, we're going to give you some time to set your own goals for strengthening peer learning activities, really designed to empower multilingual learners with their literacy development. So in reading and writing in the content areas. So we did upload our session materials to the web page, but we do also have what we're calling our resource hub. So if you use the QR code here, or if you drop this link, if you access this link, you will get this resource hub where you can access some session resources. We also are going to be doing a book raffle, so you can enter the raffle and you can learn a little bit more about Support Ed. So if you click on the Explore Session Resources, one of the options that will pop up will be for this Padlet, and this Padlet will be available to you after the session. So if you want to go back and look through this a little bit later, we have a whole lot of resources about this topic. The materials that we're going to be using today are all in this first column. So there is a PDF of the presentation. If you'd like to follow along, there's a link to the Google folder. And then the tools that we're going to be talking about during the session are also included in that first column of the Padlet. So here is just a little look at what's inside that Google folder. And again, it really matches what's in that first column of the Padlet. And also these are the items that have been uploaded to the Patan website. Those tools, I believe, are all together as one tools packet, but you do have all of these in there. So as I mentioned, some of my colleagues have written this book, Unlocking Multilingual Learners' Potential. This is actually a relatively recent publication. It's been updated. If you're familiar with Unlocking English Learners' Potential, this is an updated version. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today really is coming from this book. We're really going to be focusing on Chapter 4, which discusses peer learning, and Chapter 8, engaging multilingual learners in reading and writing in the content areas. And as I mentioned, we are going to be raffling off a book. So you can either access the resource hub, or you can use this QR code right now to access your entry into the book raffle. There's a form that'll pop up and you can access and enter the book raffle. So I'm going to leave that up there just for a second if anybody wants to get that QR code. And Jasmine is also dropping some links in the chat. So everything that we're going to be talking about today is really grounded in our framework for equitable and excellent ML education. So we have 5 different components to this framework. And while some of these components are kind of overlapping and they build on each other, we're really going to be focusing on number 4 today, which is that MLs thrive when their teachers include opportunities for peer learning and meaningful conversations. So just to get us started and to start thinking about how we might engage multilingual learners in reading and writing, I'd like you just to take a little bit of time to introduce yourself in the chat and share your favorite way to engage MLs in reading or writing in the content areas. So anything you do yourself, maybe something that you've seen another teacher do. Okay, great. Thank you, Ren. I see group work, mapping, learning logs, sketching, drawing, structured conversations. Great. Some of the things we're going to touch on today. Sentence frames, very popular. Guided writing. TPR, visuals, great. So I'm going to encourage everybody to continue to drop things. I see a lot of things coming through the chat very quickly right now. So feel free to continue dropping things in there and introducing yourself as we move along. So the first thing we want to do today is talk a little bit about the research on supporting multilingual learners in reading and writing. So whether you have downloaded the documents, or if you are on the Padlet, or if you're in the Google folder, the first document is our note-taking tool. And that's just there for you if you want to jot down some ideas as I'm sharing some of this research. And I would just encourage you to be thinking about, as I'm sharing the research, if you notice any repeated themes, anything that you notice or wonder about, or just general takeaways as they might apply to your own context. So I'm sure most people are very familiar with the 5 components identified by the National Reading Panel. And research has shown that these 5 components are also important for multilingual learners. But additional research, particularly the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth, found that when we're working with supporting literacy development for multilingual learners, we need to go a little bit beyond those 5 components and adding some additional instructional practices that specifically target the strengths and needs of multilingual learners. And more recently, Kathy Escamilla and some of her colleagues have been doing some research where they have really been very clear and very articulate about the idea that literacy cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach, but we really need to consider the specific backgrounds of the students in front of us, recognize the importance of home language and any kind of instruction that students may have had in their home language. And really, as we're learning more and more about the brain, there's a lot more brain research that we are aware of today than probably even in 2006. that we need to be aware of the uniqueness of the dual language brain, or really any student who's learning, more than one language, so even beyond dual language. And we have learned that language processing in a bilingual brain is different than language processing in a monolingual brain, as students are using what they know about their first language to build and develop their second language. And they're using comparisons, often comparing one language to the additional language that they're learning. And these are all things that we need to be considering when we're thinking about literacy development. So effective literacy instruction for multilingual learners is going to include all of what we want to, how we want to approach literacy for all students in terms of teaching foundational skills in context, integrating meaning making with language development, and these foundational skills for reading. But we want to be really careful when we're working with multilingual learners that we're also scaffolding so that students are able to participate and they're able to comprehend and build their language skills at the same time that they're beginning to learn to read and write and all of these other literacy components that we're working on. We know that students benefit from the integration of language development with content. And we also know that it's really important to be leveraging multilingual learners' linguistic assets, as well as their cultural backgrounds. So to that end, we want to make sure that when we're using materials and books, that we're using things that include multilingual learners' backgrounds. So culturally relevant materials for students. They're really going to be able to connect to those types of materials. And it's also really important for students that we're focusing on reading comprehension skills and consider the sociocultural factors that are going to play a role in students developing literacy. Writing, also an essential skill. And again, connecting writing to what students are reading is really going to be a powerful way to enhance multilingual learners' literacy skills. So when we talk about reading comprehension for multilingual learners, we want to make sure that we're providing the scaffolding that students are going to need to make complex text accessible to them. In addition to that scaffolding, or one important scaffold, is going to be building background and also developing students' metacognitive skills and metalinguistic skills. So as students are learning and reading, we want to make sure that they're also developing the skills to understand what they're doing as readers, so that they are eventually becoming more independent, but also thinking about language. So what are they learning about language? What are they noticing about grammar that's going to help them, again, as they become more independent learners? One strategy that's been really effective for students is these collaborative close reads, because it does provide that collaborative piece, that interaction to be thinking about and sharing their ideas about a text, and also the opportunity to go back into texts. And we are going to talk a little bit more about collaborative close reads a little bit later. And again, with writing, we want to link what we're asking students to write about with their content learning, which is going to give them another opportunity to focus on academic language development. And again, in this effort to provide scaffolds, we want to make sure that we're providing language-based support. So several things that people have already mentioned. We might use graphic organizers, we might use sentence starters, word walls, all of these as language supports that are going to help students further develop their writing skills. Another great scaffold for students is to be able to work in small groups or in pairs, so they can collaborate around different aspects of writing. And also, just as it's beneficial for all students, it's going to be really beneficial for students if teachers are regularly assessing their writing, identifying areas of needs, and really giving positive, constructive feedback. So students need to know what their next step might be. They need to know what they're doing well, what they can build on, and how they might plan for their next steps. in writing. So I think we've mentioned made a couple of different points today already about how reading and writing are connected. And oftentimes when students are reading or writing, they're making use of the same skills and knowledge. So for example, if they're learning about spelling patterns or a particular discourse pattern, that information that they're reading is also going to be something that they can use in their writing. And when students as writers are thinking about their audience, they're going to be able to bring that to their reading and think about perspective, like understanding an author's perspective and recognizing that an author is writing for a particular audience. So they can, use those skills in reading and writing. We also have research that tells us that when reading and writing are combined, students have greater understanding of the content and they're better able to retain information. And we also know that teaching students how to read and synthesize key ideas from a text is going to support them in then writing a synthesis of a text. So being able to think about key points and then being able to write about it. So really important that we're teaching reading and writing kind of side by side. And then to get into specifically the benefits of peer learning for multilingual learners, we know that oral language development supports literacy. Academic conversations are going to, again, give students another opportunity to practice, meaningful opportunities to hear language, to practice content-specific vocabulary, maybe practice some sentence structures that might be specific to certain types of texts. Peer learning also supports stronger social emotional skills, and it's also a wonderful opportunity for formative assessment. So I would like to just throw this question out there. How much time during the school day do you think multilingual learners now spend engaged in academic conversation? And you can just drop into the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4. I see a lot of 2s, a 1, a couple of 3s. Okay, so oftentimes you guys have a really realistic perception of what is happening. It is at about 5 to 10%. Oftentimes teachers are surprised by that. They think that students are talking a whole lot more than they are talking. But somebody did make the comment that it should be more. And really the goal is for students to be spending about 30% of their school day engaged in academic conversations. And that comes from some research by Pauline Gibbons. And one way that we can really work towards providing more opportunities for this type of conversation is to reframe the way talking is currently happening in classrooms. Oftentimes what we see is the teacher to student discourse, the teacher asks a question and one student responds. And we really want to shift that to providing more opportunities for student to student discourse. And you can see in the second picture that more students are engaged in the conversation than in the first picture where they're relying on interacting only with the teacher. So at this point, I'm going to sort of close down the research discussion component and just wondering, as you were listening to the research and maybe jotting down some notes, if you noticed any repeated themes or if you had any noticings or wonderings around the research. This course is important. Yes. Yeah, they need to talk more. Oral language is important. Why? Yeah, Beth, there's the question. Why doesn't the research make it into practice? Yeah, And that's a great observation. We see it a lot, that best practices for multilingual learners are really going to benefit all students. So thinking about, yeah, so hopefully today you'll walk away with at least a couple of strategies that you can work with teachers about really cultivating this sense of conversation and more of a classroom that really encourages that kind of interaction. Yeah, and speaking and listening often overlooked because they're not measured on state assessments. And I think we've kind of shifted into takeaways from your context, but if anybody has anything else that they want to share as we move on, feel free to drop into the chat any takeaway around the research for your own context. But we are going to move into thinking about considerations in implementing peer learning routines. So knowing that we're working with multilingual learners, knowing that peer learning is really going to be good for all students, what do we need to keep in mind thinking about, how we want to support multilingual learners? So let's start by really thinking about what is a peer learning routine. And a peer learning routine can start off as a specific instructional strategy where the teacher is sharing a set of steps to complete an academic task, and that has students working with either one or more peers. And this strategy becomes a routine once it's implemented regularly, and students have gotten to the point really where they're able to kind of run through this routine themselves. They're able to implement this strategy without the teacher constantly needing to remind them of the steps. One that comes to mind that I do see relatively often in classrooms is either something like a turn and talk or something like a think, pair, share, where initially the teacher is going to run through the steps and probably often, especially with the think, pair, share, initially have to remind students, nope, you're not just going to turn immediately to your partner. You have to take a minute or two to think, which could really be a struggle for some students. But eventually, this is going to become so ingrained in the process that this really becomes a peer learning routine. And of course, this peer learning activity is designed to support learning, to reach some kind of, you're going to have some kind of learning and probably some language objective. There's a reason why you're setting up this peer learning routine. So students know what to do by the end of the peer learning routine. I do have a video that I'm going to share. And as we watch the video, I want you to be thinking about what types of peer learning routines you think this teacher, Miss Nava, has already implemented, taught, and established in her classroom to support student engagement. And also thinking about how the use of the routines really supports stronger discussions and learning for multilingual learners. So again, we want to think about when we're implementing peer learning, we're not doing it, just for the sake of students to work with a partner, but there really is a goal of students developing oral language and also learning some content. So we want to make sure that they're developing stronger discussions and that there is learning that's taking place. And then also just some general glows and grows that you have from the video. So I am going to start that.
Funding for Common Core State Standards and ELLs is provided by the American Federation of Teachers.
Just going to skip through that.
You are going to be doing a cooperative paragraph.
Ali Nava is having her second graders work on a cooperative paragraph about the text they're studying, Burros Tortillas.
Either beginning, middle, or end. And as a group, you guys need to come up with an exemplary sentence about what happened during each part of the story, whatever your part is.
To begin, she breaks the students into small groups and assigns each group a section of the story to summarize.
Discuss with your group, and you're going to write the same sentence. What happened in either whatever you're assigned, beginning, middle, or end. And when you're done, we're going to come back and share those out. Does everyone understand that? I don't want to see you just sitting down and starting writing away. You got to talk to each other to see what you're going to put.
The students then discuss the story and come up with a summary sentence together. As extra guidance, Ms. Nava lets the students reference story flashcards and their previous summary worksheets. Once the groups have their summary statements ready, Ms. Nava brings everyone together so they can share their work.
The sentence you came up with in the little rectangle part. It should be the same sentence. You guys agreed upon it. And each of you, each group was assigned either beginning, middle, or end. So raise your hand if you were assigned the beginning part. Brooklyn was, who else? Isabella, Tom? Okay, Brooklyn, share your sentence, please. I'm gonna put number 1. And we're gonna start right here. So Brooklyn, you're gonna share with everybody what your group came up with for the first part, okay? What is the sentence you came up with?
Our groups did, he found corn to make tortillas.
An exercise like this gives English language learners a low-pressure situation in which to practice their language skills. They interact with their peers orally, write with the assistance of classmates, then have the option of sharing that work with the whole class.
So now, can we read this sentence? Can you read it for me, please?
Tortillas.
Does this look okay to you?
No.
No? Why? Oh, Mr. Race, are there mistakes? Did I miss?
Ms. Nava intentionally makes errors while writing the sentences so that she can ask the students to spot the mistakes and make the corrections.
Okay, Brooklyn, correct the first mistake. So what did you do?
It can be lowercase if you're starting a new sentence.
How do we start a sentence? Capital letter, capital letter. Start a sentence every time. Capital letter, capital letter. Somebody else to find another mistake.
This exercise gives the students an engaging way to demonstrate their understanding of the standard conventions of English spelling, capitalization, and punctuation, all of which they need to know in order to meet an important common core milestone.
There's supposed to be a period.
Stop that there.
She caught the
I'm going to go back here and we can think about some of the questions. So what types of peer learning routines do you think Ms. Nava implemented to support student engagement? And you can just drop your responses in the chat. Okay, so I see structured conversations. They already had the materials and assigned partners. Yep, and we're going to be talking about those partner assignments a little bit later on. Discussing before writing. You can tell when they have, when they're sharing that they're used to making and correcting mistakes. So she's modeling that as well. Great. Anything that stands out to you around the use of these routines to support stronger discussions and learning for multilingual learners? Really, some of the things that you've already mentioned relate to that too, discussing before writing, practice talking, agreeing on a common sentence. As I watched that video and was thinking about second graders and my own experience with second graders, like that idea of learning how to negotiate and make a decision around what your common sentence is going to be is probably very challenging for them. So any other glows or grows that you have from the video? Lots of critical thinking. Yeah. Yep. Great. So again, I'll encourage you, if you think of something, feel free to continue dropping things in the chat, but we are going to move on and talk about some additional practices that will enhance engagement in peer learning for multilingual learners. And these three practices that we have here are creating a welcoming environment, scaffolding instruction, and the use of strategic peer grouping. So the first tool that we have to share, and this would be document 2 if you're in the Google folder, but again, it's also on the Padlet if you want to access it there. This tool was set up to help design a welcoming environment so that students feel comfortable, but also designed to think about things that would help support a language learning classroom. So some of the look-fors include having desks clustered. When students walk into a classroom and they see that desks are clustered or students are sitting in groups, we're already kind of sending the message that, like, these people at your table are kind of your partners and you might be working together. It also makes it really easy to find a partner to talk to. When students are in rows or have a different type of table setup or desk setup, it might not be as easy to interact with a peer. So that checklist is something that you can take a look at in terms of thinking about some things you might want to put in place in a classroom to create this environment that will help students understand that they're in a language learning environment and that they're going to be interacting with their peers. So the other thing we want to talk about in terms of creating this welcoming environment and developing learning partnerships is how this develops. And this is research that comes from Zaretta Hammond, and she explains that learning partnerships are made up of 3 components. And it starts with this one here, which is rapport. So that's where we're making the emotional connections and building trust. And then in the next step, which is called the alliance phase, this is where the teacher and student come together to support learning, tackle something that might be a little bit more challenging. And since they've already just established this relationship, it's a little bit easier for the teacher to push the student a little bit more and try and get a little bit more out of the student without the student becoming upset or defensive or pulling back. And then the alliance allows this cognitive insight to happen. So this is where the teacher and the student both are becoming more aware of the student's thinking routines and their learning. So we want to really try and think about, if we've gone through these 3 stages and that all of these components are present when we're starting to encourage students to share a little bit more and become more engaged in class. Somebody mentioned already scaffolded conversations. And I think for a lot of teachers, this is a really great starting point. And I think this also relates to the idea how these strategies are good for all students. So even students who come to our classrooms with, high levels of English proficiency or who are native English speakers might struggle with really having a conversation. Sometimes they need to have that conversation modeled for them. And starting with a very structured conversation really gives them that opportunity. And you can see here where this teacher assigned partner A and partner B and literally told partner A and B what they were going to do. And there was only one small piece in this very beginning scaffolded structured conversation that each student is going to need to fill in. But a really key component that I've noticed as I've visited classrooms is this first step is usually pretty easy. Partner A knows the question to ask, and partner B knows how to respond to the question. Most kids don't really have a lot of skill in carrying on that conversation. So it really requires some teaching and some sharing and some modeling to then say to partner B, okay, now you can ask that question. So in the beginning, sometimes teachers push back a little bit around something like this because they feel like, well, they're not really having a real conversation. But this is the scaffolding and this is the structure that students need to get used to so that they will be able to turn this type of structured conversation into more of a routine. It might not even be the exact same question that they're going to turn around and ask their partner, but just this experience with the back and forth, and I respond, and then I ask a question to get more information, is something that students need to get familiar with. And you can see here, again, based on language proficiency, we may add even more scaffolds for students, depending on what they may need in terms of their language development or their experience with having conversations. Another strategy that we use to scaffold instruction is something called text engineering. And the idea around text engineering is to really shift away from the thinking that we need to simplify text, especially for students that have lower levels of English proficiency, and really to engineer the text a little bit more so that it's accessible to them. So the steps that you might take to do this are to first start out by chunking the text, and then you might look at the text and think where you can embed some linguistic clues. So are there some vocabulary words where you might embed a definition? That might be a linguistic clue for somebody. You might add visuals or captions, or you might provide an audio version of the text if that's accessible. And here is an example of an engineered text. So anything that's highlighted or in parentheses is something that's been added, and the visuals have been added. So you can see there in those first parentheses that there is a little bit of an explanation of what that term "are dominated by" might mean. And that's something else that we would want to teach students, is that sometimes in a text, when we come across a new word or a new expression, in parentheses, there might be a little bit of an explanation. So here there were also places in this text where the teacher chose to use a translation into Spanish, and also to show that there's a cognate in Spanish. So all steps to help students access this more complex text rather than simplifying the text. So the third idea around creating a welcoming environment to help students feel comfortable participating is also to think about how we might group students. And another tool that we have for you is this considerations and intentionally grouping students. And the idea around the tool is to think about really what your goals are for the lesson, and that might shift how you're going to be grouping students within the lesson. So there are going to be some times where it's going to make more sense for you to group students that have the same home language together. So they might be able to have some kind of background building conversation in their home language. And there might be some times where it's really going to be more meaningful for the students to struggle a little bit with their English, or to be working with English speaking peers who are going to be able to support them in providing an answer using more academic language. So we're going to want to be thinking about the purpose of the lesson and the different skills and the different languages and that students are coming to the lesson with, and think about how we can really be strategic in grouping students. So here's a scenario that we're going to talk about a little bit. If you have that considerations and intentionally grouping students tool up, you can take a look at that and review some of the considerations. And here's the scenario. So students are going to begin a new unit on conservation. So to tap into prior knowledge, students are going to look at conservation images and brainstorm a list of important ideas related to conservation. Students will work in small groups to discuss the images and brainstorm their ideas. So the question is, knowing this scenario, how might you group students and why? What decision would you make around grouping? And you can drop some of those ideas into the chat. So thinking about whether you might put students together that have the same language, students with different languages, students with different academic experiences. How would you group these students? Okay, so one idea is small groups, but maybe a rotation around the room. Okay. Oh, another room rotation with the different pictures. Uh-huh. Gallery walk. So what might you be thinking about in terms of putting the students in the group? So I see somebody said the same home language if possible. So this is an example where we're building background. So it might be beneficial to students to be with others that do have the same home language so they can really discuss the images. There's not really, at this point, we're not really looking for specific academic language that we want students to use yet. We're really just tapping into some prior knowledge. So this is a time where we might consider grouping students with the same native language peers. And anything else that you would want to know about the students in order to be able to group them? Any other thoughts about that? So yeah, you definitely want to know their language proficiency. You might want to know which students already have some knowledge on this topic. Maybe you have a student who's always reading, who's always taken the books from the library about conservation or the environment. So maybe there are some students that already know. I see not just language proficiency, but also interests. Yeah, you might want to know about their interests, which might lead to a different type of conversation if you have students who are really interested in this particular topic. Okay, so this other tool that we have used and shared ourselves in professional development and also seen teachers use in classrooms is this dining partners. And it gives you an opportunity to assign partners for different purposes. You can have a student sign up to be a breakfast partner, a lunch partner, and a dinner partner. You can do this at the beginning of the day so that as there are opportunities throughout the day, they already have their partner set up. We don't have to go through that process of looking for a partner. Sometimes you can also share criteria for a particular partner. Like you can say, choose a breakfast partner who is wearing red shoes. It could be something completely non-academic related, or you can make it a little bit more academic related. You might say, choose a partner who does speak the same home language that you speak, knowing that the question that you ask is going to, the students are going to be better able to respond, or they're going to be able to engage with this partner based on who they're selecting. So again, this is more opportunity for language practice, even negotiating partners. But this is something that could be almost like random choice, or you have the opportunity to think about really developing criteria for these partnerships. When we've used it in professional development, we've asked teachers to choose somebody that they don't know. So that way we're encouraging somebody to, make a different connection. We have said, choose somebody who works on the same grade level of you, but teaches a different content area. So you can make it very specific. So the fourth tool that we are sharing is our peer learning activity checklist. And this provides, again, some things for you to think about as you're developing peer learning activities. And if you want to take just a quick minute to take a look at this tool, which is document 5, but also included in that tools packet, just think about if you notice any connections to some of the practices that we've discussed already. Is there anything on here that makes you think, oh, yes, this connects to creating a welcoming environment, or this will help with scaffolded instruction, or something around strategic peer grouping? Anything that you notice in this tool? And thanks, Jasmine, for dropping all these direct links. Okay, well, it may take a minute for people to have a little bit of an opportunity to read through all of that. Um, but as I wrap up this section around thinking about the tools, I would like to ask you to think about which tool really resonated with you, which is something that you feel like you could really share with your colleagues. The welcoming environment classroom checklist, the considerations for grouping students, the dining partners, or the peer learning activity checklist. And you can just drop 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. Okay, so the welcoming environment I see, the peer learning. Oh, and now I see dining partners. So and there's a 2. So great, something for everybody. Okay, great. So let's move into talking a little bit about some scaffolded peer learning routines. And as we get into this section, we're going to be talking about a couple of routines for reading and a couple of routines for writing. But just to get started, I'm going to ask you to share in the chat an example of a peer learning routine that you're already using or that you've seen used in a classroom or in your context to support reading and writing development for multilingual learners. So any type of peer learning routine that you're already seeing that supports reading or writing. Okay, so some Kagan structure, some cooperative learning. I see PALS. I'm not sure I know what PALS is. Peer editing, visible thinking routines. Great. Peer reading coaches. Okay, great. Okay, so partner reading. All right, keep dropping those in there. So as I said, I'm going to share 2 strategies for reading and 2 strategies for writing. And we're going to start with reading. And this also connects to activating background knowledge. And one thing that we can have students do, and they can do this with a partner or in a small group, is to develop some questions. This is before they really dive into the text itself, but develop some questions based on text features. So this example here is really a science example, and there's a whole lot of information that you can see, and that just even the structure of the text that is providing a lot of information and also potentially a lot of questions that students might come up with. There are tables, charts, images, the subheadings. So just looking at those text features, giving students an opportunity just to raise some questions. And then, of course, once they go into their reading, they might find answers to some of those questions. Their partner might share some answers to some of those questions, and just, it's just helping them get ready to get into that reading and think about that reading. And then the second strategy I'm going to share today is called the 3 read protocol. And as I was reading through this, I was thinking this really kind of reminds me of how we do a close read in ELA. This really gives us an opportunity in math to really take a deeper look at word problems. And we are supporting students through figuring out this word problem by, in the first read, just reading to understand the story, like what is happening in this story. And then the second read to really start thinking about the math. And then finally, we're going through the third read to make a plan for solving the problem. And you can see a little bit of the structure and the supports that are provided here to students in going through this protocol. There's a space, there's the directions, and there's a space for students to kind of think through what they're getting out of the problem at each particular space, so that they are really getting some scaffolding in thinking through the problem. So I would like you to think about how this strategy supports multilingual learners in understanding both the language and the math that they need to solve a word problem. In my own experience and working with multilingual learners in math, I feel like a lot of times students are not taking the time to understand the story and what's really happening in the story in this word problem, and they're really jumping to the math. So one thing is it really helps them slow down and just really think about what is happening, which really kind of sets them up for thinking about how they're going to think about the math. So any ideas around how the strategy supports and understanding both language and the math, and anything that you're thinking of in terms of additional scaffolds that MLs might need? Which actually kind of answers this question about engineering the text and word problems. That might be an additional scaffold. You could engineer that text a little bit, maybe provide some definitions for some difficult words. I know a lot of students really get hung up on names. Like if they see a name, they have no idea, they've never heard that name, that can really throw them off. So, you know, giving a little bit of an explanation, maybe a visual to let students know that that's a person. Okay, and I see that Sylvia has shared that step one is really like getting the main idea, summarizing, and then adding in the read aloud, having students join you and then practicing it. Okay, so again, making that connection to how we might do that with ELA. Great. Anything, and again, there is an example of this on the Padlet. If you want to take a little bit of a more look through that, I know we have a really tight session today, so we're not really walking through that. But if you want to look through this scaffolded 3-read protocol for multilingual learners, this is available on the Padlet. So moving into how a strategy where we might support students in writing is this idea of mentor sentences. So to think about mentor sentences, the teacher would select a complex sentence, a sentence that's important for students to understand in terms of the text that they're reading, and work with students to explore the sentence. And you can see here in this example that there's a lot of notations going on, pointing out a subordinating conjunction on the very towards the end of the sentence, pointing out the adverbial phrase, pointing out an adverb with some highlighting. So really kind of breaking down the sentence with students. And then the teacher really should have in mind kind of a focus in selecting the sentence. Why did I select the sentence? Whether it's, you know, like a grammar focus that they really want to help students understand. And then they'll develop a focus phrase that the students will practice, and then they can compare it to other sentences, and then students can write their own sentences. So I do have another example here. So here, a mentor sentence might be, I wanted to be bigger, stronger, older. And, you know, as a class or in a small group, the teacher and the students can really break down the sentence, talk about what they notice, and the teacher can articulate that really the focus on here is comparing things. It's comparatives. But then teach students this focus phrase. I compare two things using ER or more. And the students will actually repeat and learn that focus phrase so that then when they then go back and do their own writing, that's what they're thinking. When I'm writing a comparative, I compare two things using ER or more, never both. So then they can check their own writing and make sure that they're following along and meeting that focus phrase. So here's a little example. You may have heard this sentence before. You may have read this book. If you give a mouse a cookie. So if you take a mouse to school, he'll ask you for your lunchbox. So what might be the focus for this mentor sentence? Or if you want, you can drop in what you think might be the focus phrase. What would you teach students? Okay, cause and effect. Yeah. Cause and effect. Yep. Okay. And what might you teach students to be the focus phrase to support that? Additional causes. I guess depending on level, different types of things. using a comma after the clause. So, you can teach students your focus phrase, again, depending on the level of the students and your actual goal for the lesson. You can teach students, when I start my sentence with if, I'm probably going to need to use a comma. So if you take a mouse to school, comma, and when you're teaching them that whether it's cause and effect, conditional clauses, you want them to be practicing writing these sentences with if, saying this focus phrase to themselves. If I use if, I'm probably going to use a comma, and then going back and checking and making sure that they've also used a comma. So we also have on the Padlet really going through this mentor sentence routine and thinking about some considerations for multilingual learners. And, again, that resource is there. You can take a look at it at any time to think about how you can be really intentional about planning the use of mentor sentences and how you can really develop this into a routine. And then the final thing that I want to share in terms of strategies is color-coded writing. So students can work collaboratively to respond to a prompt. Each student has their own color. The color really holds students to accountability. You want to make sure that you see each color in the final response. And you can start this if students are struggling to work in groups, or if they're just getting used to writing a response. You want to make sure that everybody's really writing. You can start with pairs, eventually move into larger groups. And then after they do the writing, you also want to make sure you're modeling ways of sharing their ideas. Like when they're working in that group and they're writing a sentence together, students are not just writing words, because you want to be thinking about, as you're writing, you want to be thinking through, like, how are we going to share our ideas and make some suggestions around what might be the next word? What happens if I write and that completely throws off my partner around what they thought they were going to write next? How are students going to talk through and negotiate how they're going to construct that sentence? So the color coding is happening, but there's also this opportunity for engaging in this conversation around like planning that writing and developing that sentence. So let's just take a minute now and think about the strategies, the reading and writing strategies that we discussed. And I'm going to ask you to share a strategy that you would like to implement or share with your own colleagues, thinking about your own context. What would you like to share? Oh, I see somebody already in there is going to share crafting questions. Great. See the mentor sentences. Okay. Oh, people like mentor sentences. Okay.
Mindy, while they're doing that, I just wanted to let you know we have like 16 minutes or so.
Okay, great. Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, Sylvia, that we focus on students answering questions, but asking questions often gets lost. So that's also really powerful for students to really be able to be thinking about how they're going to craft questions. So since we are getting to the end of the session, and I want to leave time for questions and answers, the very last thing that I would like you to do, just in terms of setting your own goals, is just to respond to this Mentimeter and keeping my fingers crossed that all our technology works. So if you access the menti.com and you use the code at the top of the screen, and I know Jasmine has already probably dropped it in the chat, but just respond to this prompt: to strengthen the use of peer learning routines, to support MLs in reading and writing in my context, I will. So what is one thing that you want to take away that you're going to do? Great. Let me see if I can, oh, I can't move this QR code, but okay, great. The mentor sentences, making language visible, mindful student groupings. Okay, great. And so as people are dropping these things into the Mentimeter, I would also say this is a good time to open it up to questions. So if anybody has any questions, I guess we can either use the chat or the Q&A, right? Okay, great. Great. I love seeing all the responses. Yeah, and discussing them in coaching. Great. Yes, we don't have any questions. Any comments? Anything?
It's not looking that way. That means you were very thorough
Okay.
and anticipated questions.
All right, I'll take that. Well, thank you for your comments. And I'll just say, like, as we're wrapping up, thank you for your participation and for engaging today. As I said, the Padlet is available. Oh, the other thing that we forgot is we have I almost forgot, is that we have the book raffle. I don't want to forget that. So we can go ahead and do that, right?